July 1st, 2020. I downloaded the trial version of FL Studio as an upgrade from GarageBand. Upon opening, immediate intimidation. A wide, open, full screen of different controls, windows, sidebars, and various possibilities to explore. Fast forward 6 months, 17 days, I've now gained a decent understanding of the digital audio workstation, and I produce music for a hobby. I've delved into lo-fi, electronic music, trap, and I use the software to compose classical as well. And I now finally feel qualified to make this video. Also, I may or may not make this into a 3-part series, so make sure to subscribe because it would really help out my channel. The first video in the series being the basics. If you're wondering, I have the producer version of FL Studio 20. If you're still in trial version, you won't be able to do the same things as me. Before I start, you'll notice that there are a few differences between my screen and yours. 1, I have different things highlighted in this section. These are just my preferences, which I'll get into later. 2, my mixer is coloured and yours won't be. That's because I customized it, and I'll also get into that later. And lastly, I have a different background to you, which also I'll get into later. Throughout the video, if you happen to not understand a certain function, or its name for that matter, there is an error in the top left side of the screen labelled Hint Panel. This should help you if you're a beginner. Right, let's begin. The most important feature in FL Studio that makes it so much more different to other music software is that it works using what are called patterns. These are basically the building blocks for your project, along with audio and automation clips. You can view both of these on this sidebar by either clicking the Pattern or Audio tab. The idea of patterns is that you can make the individual parts for your project, such as the chords, melody, bass, or whatever, and string it all together in the playlist. I'll explain how to create patterns later in the video, but for now I'm going to make my way across the entire top panel and explain its functions, starting with the second most important feature in FL Studio, the playlist. Every single DAW will have this built into it, and it's where the entire song is arranged. The playlist will be open by default, but the button to open or close it is here. This is the playlist tab. Next to this is the piano roll. If you aren't familiar with this layout, then yeah, it's a bit daunting, but if you've had experience with GarageBand, like me, or any other program, then you should get an idea on how to navigate this menu. There are 4 things that I'm wanting to show you for now, and those are the pencil tool, erase tool, select tool, and cut tool. These are the essentials for the piano roll. The different ways of selecting these tools are either by clicking the icon or using shortcuts such as P for the pencil tool. The other shortcuts are here if you need them. If you've already started penciling in notes and realizing that there's no piano sound coming out, congratulations, you have just made the same mistake that I made ages ago. And I don't blame you. The reason why this might be happening is because you haven't loaded up a piano sound yet. But to do that, you'll need to bring up the channel rack, which is conveniently the next thing I'm wanting to show you. The channel rack is where you can drag and drop sounds, plugins, and samples into. I've already loaded some stuff here, but you won't have them. All you'll have is a kick, snare, clap, and hi-hat. This is FL Studio's default channel rack. There are a few different ways of using the sounds here. For drums, the easiest technique is by clicking on these parts here. To hear what you've just created, press play, and you should see the buttons light up. I recommend messing around with this first because you'll begin to get a feel for how the channel rack works. Another technique is to select a sound by highlighting this part, and then clicking the piano roll, or by right-clicking the sound here and selecting piano roll, which is actually a lot easier. Although this isn't very useful for drums. So to find a piano sound, let's go to the left sidebar and click on it where it says Packs, and then Instruments, and then look inside the Keyboards file. Next, pick one that has a cog icon next to it and then drag it into the channel rack. By the way, just ignore the massive thing that pops up behind it. For future reference, if you're needing to find other instruments or sounds to mess around with, then have a look in this Packs folder. There's a lot it has to offer. If you want my advice on where to find the really good drums, then check out Drums by Mode Audio, especially the Foley samples, they're really fun. Going back into our piano roll, we can finally begin to start making stuff. Same thing with the channel rack, I encourage you to mess around with it first, so they can get a feel for it and understand it. By the way, quick tip, if you've tried selecting and deleting multiple notes, using the delete button on your keyboard, you'll find nothing happens. Well, congratulations, again, you've made the same mistake as me. Because for some weird reason, the delete button controls this thing right here, which is confusing because it's actually the toggle for quantizing, or the snap, for patterns and clips in the playlist, which is obviously not delete. But if you do want to select and delete multiple notes, I recommend just doing the cut shortcut, which is Command X. It basically does the same thing. I need to move on because I've taken a long time on the first few stuff. Next up is the mixer, which is the second last thing I'll show you for these tabs. Because I'm only wanting to show you the basics, just ignore the rest for now, and maybe Google them if you're curious. The mixer is where you control all of the volumes, EQ, and audio effects for your project. In the channel rack, if you look here, the numbers are corresponding to the tracks on the mixer. So if you have a very large project, it's always good to keep things organized. If you're wanting to record audio through an interface, you can select the input and output here. If you're wanting to add effects to the track, click the arrow here and find what you need. The more straightforward stuff about the mixer is like the mute, solo button, pan, and volume. Easy. Lastly, the only one out of the rest of these that I'll show you is the plugin picker. If you're a visual person like me, finding plugins is 10 times easier. Also, if you still can't find it, there's a search bar. If you're having troubles getting the grasp of what a generator plugin is, just think of them as a board game extension. Kind of. Now I'll move over to this menu panel and explain what these all do. I'm going to try and breeze through this first few because there's not much to them. The File tab is mainly for creating new projects or finding previous ones, and it's also where you can export or import audio. The Edit tab is somewhat pointless because you can just use shortcuts. The Add tab is basically for opening up either generator or effect plugins. Now, the View tab actually has quite a lot to it, and I'll go more in depth in part 2, along with the Tools tab. Basically, it's used to customize stuff, change layouts, and manage windows, as well as a lot more. It's also how you can change your wallpaper, so that's pretty cool. Next, we have Options. The first 8 of these will bring up the same window, which is essentially the settings menu. Here you can enable a MIDI controller, select an audio interface, set a time signature, or even change the language. With Tools, the only thing I've ever really used is the dump score log to selected pattern, which you don't actually need to know about yet. Lastly, the Help tab, for if you want help. Duh. Over here we have the master volume and pitch, but I recommend not using these because it's a lot more efficient just to use the mixer. 10 times better. Next, the pattern and song toggle, which is for changing what you're wanting to play. For example, if I had a pattern with something in it, I can select it, switch to pattern mode, and then it'll start playing whatever's in that pattern. Whereas the song mode will activate the playlist and play whatever is there. Then the play, pause, and record buttons, and the tempo, which you can change like so. And then there are these options. As I mentioned earlier, I'll have different buttons highlighted because they are my preferences. If you want, you can change yours to mine because they're mainly helpful for MIDI recording. So if you don't have a MIDI controller, there's probably no need for these. So now I'll quickly go through the functions. There's the metronome, which I'm pretty sure you know what it is. Then there's this one, which is for MIDI recording, and the second you start playing, it'll automatically start recording. This one's a countdown for recording, also very helpful. Then this one's for overdubbing, which is where you can record on top of what you just played before, and then the next one is for looping. Those two go hand in hand. This one will make certain letters on your keyboard become notes on a piano, but it's not very helpful if you frequently use shortcuts like me. The scroll till end time markers is where the screen will follow where it's being played in the project. Normally I don't need these because I just zoom out. It's a bit easier. The step edit is basically where you can type in notes using a MIDI controller, but I don't find this so helpful. Lastly, the multi-link controller button. I normally don't have this highlighted all the time, even though I use a MIDI controller. The button is for mapping out notes or pads on MIDI controllers, but I don't do that very often. Right, I've gone through absolutely everything I planned on showing you. These are, in my opinion, the fundamentals of FL Studio. You'll notice that I left out this entire sidebar, but that's because I figured that all you'll normally be using is the projects and packs folder. The rest you can ignore for now and maybe look at later. Some of the maybe smaller things to point out are the CPU levels, which is how much computer power is being used, the tempo tapper, which is not too hard to figure out, and lastly, the official FL Studio website for help and troubleshooting, which is this button right here. All of this being said, I just wanted to thank you for making it this far in the video. That in itself is a compliment to me, but if you do want to support the channel even further, then feel free to like the video and maybe subscribe as well, because chances are, you're probably not subscribed. Come on, it's free, like, you can do it right here, right now. Anyways, I'll be making part 2 whenever I get around to it, so stay tuned and maybe click the notifications button so you don't miss out. And hopefully, I'll see you very soon.